Everybody will tell you, go pick up this guy off the waiver wire right now. Go add this dude, go add this dude. But nobody ever talks about the players that we should completely avoid off the waiver wire and let our idiot league mates grab and waste a roster spot on while we're getting the good players. Lucky for you guys, that is exactly what I'm going to steer you away from. And look at the players that we need to be avoiding off the waiver wire at all costs. So let's get straight into it because everybody knows I hate to waste people's time in these videos. So the very first player we need to be avoiding letting our league mates get off the waiver wire is Odell Beckham Jr. And this is for a couple of reasons. I know after last week, everybody's saying this is the resurgence of Odell. He had a pretty decent game, but there's no universe where we would be starting Odell Beckham in 2024, even with injuries and bye weeks. He came out last week and saw 7 targets for 5 receptions and 49 yards. Not the best performance, but this really doesn't mean anything to us because he continues to not see above a 50% snap share and his floor is quite literally 0 at maybe a catch a game. And if we look at his chart from the season so far, his targets 3, 4, 4, 4, 7, they haven't been consistent. And he does not get field time. Even if he were to go up to an 80% snap share and be on the field a decent amount of time during these games, I don't see him having enough volume behind Zay Flowers and behind Mark Andrews for him to be a consistent guy. And these are the exact scenarios where we can't be buying in on hype. This is something that everybody messes up when making their waiver claims. The Ravens just came out last week and destroyed the Lions by 30 points. The entire offense was clicking. Lamar Jackson had 357 yards, 20-something pass attempts, and 3 passing touchdowns. Odell didn't get any red zone looks, and he only had 7 targets on the entire week. That is under a 4% team target share, which is extremely low. We can't take big games like this out of context and think Odell's some really solid starter. The Ravens will not continue to score 40 points or even 30 points a game, even if they are one of the better offenses in the NFL. But if this team has an insanely high passing volume day, we have to take all of these targets into consideration with how much they're passing. And when we do, again, we see a 4% team target share. It's not much different than he usually sees. This isn't a breakout resurgence game for Odell. So I would way rather use my last roster spots on a guy that has actual season-long upside. So if you want a step-by-step video on all of the players we actually need to be getting that are league winners off the waiver wire, I'll pin it somewhere in this video. I posted it yesterday. You can go watch that after this if you feel like it. It has timestamps all throughout the video, so it's pretty easy to follow. But moving over to the next guy, a running back I've seen get a whole bunch of hype recently. Again, I do not understand it, is Devin Singletary. And pretty much all of this hype is coming from the week before their bye week. Yes, he outsnapped Dameon Pierce and had a huge increase in carries compared to his season average, but he's never been consistent or had any kind of consistent snap share or carries the entirety of the season, so there's nothing we can cling on to say he's improving, and this is something we can expect all year. And if we're looking at his chart again, he hasn't seen any kind of consistent uptick in volume or even snap percentage on the field. It's been choppy, and then out of nowhere he sees a decent game and has some carries and usage, and his best game by far all season. Do I think this will be a split backfield? Most definitely. It'll probably be a 50-50 split, and Singletary will get some usage for the remainder of the season. I mean, Pierce hasn't been a good running back in his own right at all. He's one of the least efficient in the NFL. But even if Devin Singletary were to see a 60-40 split, he still cannot be trusted, and let me explain why. Earlier in the year, if you guys have watched these videos consistently, we were saying that if the Texans were going to be a top 10 passing offense in pretty much all metrics, which they have been, I would have told you Dameon Pierce must be a top running back. They must be getting a lot of checkdowns. They must be moving the ball a lot, having a lot of red zone opportunities and yards. But no, neither of these running backs for that matter have gotten any kind of significant receiving work or been efficient in general. Now, is this because of talent or how bad the offensive line is? You can leave that up to your own interpretation, but either way, that doesn't matter for fantasy football. Points are points. The Texans are bottom 5 in rush yards and pretty much last in rushing touchdowns this season, despite being in the middle of the pack in rush attempts and passing offense. The Texans aren't going to have many run-heavy scripts if they continue to be down in all of their games, which is going to continue to happen and has happened all season. And yes, 100% this will continue to be a split backfield for the remainder of the year. But if Dameon Pierce wasn't a startable running back when he was the true RB1, what makes us think that Dameon Pierce or Devin Singletary are going to be startable when it's a split committee? It just doesn't make sense. This offense isn't good enough, and you're going to rely on a touchdown for either of these guys to be startable. Their schedule does ease up for fantasy running backs for the next couple weeks, but they do have one of the hardest, if not the hardest schedules for fantasy football playoffs. But I mean, if you have these guys on your team, you probably aren't making it to the fantasy playoffs anyways. Avoid Devin Singletary. If you have Pierce, maybe roster him as a handcuff in case he gets injured. Either way, I don't think he's going to be a guy we need to be going through and wasting any kind of waiver priority or fab on. Let your idiot league mates go ahead and grab them while we pick up the real league winners. But moving on to the next guy that we need to be avoiding off of the waiver wire, a guy that I've seriously never understood on, is Keaton Mitchell. I think the narrative with him has been because there is no J.K. Dobbins, his backfield is kind of opened up and he could wiggle some way into some good usage. I seriously don't understand how anybody could think this. He is the up-and-coming rookie running back just coming off IR for anybody anybody that is wondering who he is, but I know I've been seeing a whole bunch of hype on him recently, so you probably know who he is already. But despite the Ravens absolutely destroying the Lions by 30 points, they had all of their backups in. He only saw 1 reception for 9 yards and no rushing work. And yes, I am fully aware that this is his first game and he will see an increased snap share. That is pretty much guaranteed. But if that's the case, it'll just be a 3-man running back by committee on top of the 2 running back committee they already have with Hill and Gus Edwards. And if we look at Keaton Mitchell, injuries couldn't even help him be a viable guy, because if there was some injury to one of these other running backs, it would just be, again, a 2-man by committee. There's literally no upside with this guy at all. I get he's an interesting, young, hyped up rookie. Even if he were to see a 50 or even 60% snap share for the entirety of the season, which is already a far-fetched statement, he wouldn't be startable. You'd be hoping for a touchdown every single week. They don't get some insane amount of receiving work and the rushing yards are okay, but we never want to be buying in on committee running backs because the floor and ceiling is severely lowered, especially when you have a guy like Gus Edwards who has been cutting up recently. We can leave him on the waivers for another 6 weeks, if that. We can reevaluate the situation if something happens, but either way, if he becomes the RB1, it's still going to be a committee and he's not going to be startable every week. And the Ravens have one of the hardest remaining schedules for fantasy running backs, so we can't even give him that benefit of the doubt. Not to mention, there are significant trade rumors about the Ravens signing another running back in free agency before the deadline on October 31st. Derrick Henry has been one of those rumored running backs. Do I think it's going to happen? It's possible, but there's just absolutely no room for him on our roster. I get he's hyped. Maybe halfway down the line of the season we can consider it, but nowhere near week 8 or 9 we should be considering him. But the next guy we cannot be adding off the waivers again, I've been talking about him for a couple weeks and I continue my stance on him, is Rashid Shaheed. Yes, he's a very dynamic wide receiver and is extremely helpful to the Saints in real life football, but trusting him in fantasy is not something we can go ahead and do for the remainder of the season, especially now that we have Taysom Hill having some kind of role again. Taysom Hill's had 13 targets in 2 weeks and continues to be their gadget guy at receiver, even running back and quarterback snaps. If Shaheed is the 4th option behind Chris Olave, behind Alvin Kamara, now behind Michael Thomas and Taysom Hill, there's not a lot of room for consistency and upside. I was saying this before Alvin Kamara was in this offense, before Taysom Hill had a role, and he's definitely not a guy we can trust now. He's going to continue to be even more boom or bust than he was in the beginning of the season with a low target share. If you want a true legitimate shot in the dark play every week, maybe go ahead and pick him up for bye weeks, but there are better, way better guys off the waiver wire. Don't use any kind of priority or fab on this guy. He's just not consistent, and he has no room for upside, and that is what we want on our bench. Our bench is kind of a breeding ground for potential upside league winning guys. We called out Kyron Williams earlier in the season, Tajay Spears, all of these other guys that have a real role is what we should be using our bench on. I would way rather have a high upside rookie running back or receiver. But speaking of a guy with high upside that I actually kind of like, but we just cannot buy in on, is Wan'Dale Robinson. And let me explain why I say this. Yes, he is a super dynamic wide receiver in this Giants offense. He seems to be one of the top targets for this receiving core, and he has seen some decent targets over the past few weeks. But this offense just is not viable enough to support any kind of wide receivers in fantasy since the Daniel Jones era. And we saw this exact statement come to fruition last week against the Commanders secondary, who are one of the worst and allow the most points to fantasy wide receivers. Wan'Dale comes out and catches 1 pass despite 30 attempts from Tyrod Taylor. This is a bottom 5 offense in every metric. They are last in passing touchdowns. Wan'Dale Robinson will have some great games. They'll have some really bad games, but this offense simply is not good enough for us to consider him every single week, and he has a really tough schedule coming up for the fantasy wide receivers against the Cowboys, Raiders, and Jets. If he was the only pass catcher of substance in this offense, I'd consider having him on our roster every week, but when you have Darren Waller and Saquon Barkley commanding some kind of target share, and now Jalen Hyatt coming into his own as a young breakout rookie, there isn't enough room to improve in this offense. He hasn't seen an above 70% snap share the entire season. This offense is not good. They don't pass a lot. They just really have not had a good wide receiver since Odell Beckham. But speaking of a great dynamic athlete and player, we cannot be adding off of our waiver wire, and I think it's finally time to cut ties completely, take our eyes off this guy, is Kadarius Toeny. If you still have him rostered, which is a good amount of people, he's rostered in 50% of leagues, go through and drop him. If you see him on the waiver wire, do not pick him up. I will admit he was showing some signs of life with an increased snap share over the past few weeks. He was getting more healthy, he was getting more usage, but then the Chiefs go out and sign Mecole Hardman, and he sees a season low of 19% of the snaps outside of one of the games he was injured. Kadarius Toeny has never seen a snap share above 50% in this offense. He hasn't been healthy. The Chiefs don't want to put him in this offense for some reason. Despite having a very young and unproven wide receiver core, core that anybody could get usage in. He's had a super favorable schedule over the past 3 weeks and continues to have that over the next 2 or 3 weeks, but he's done nothing with it. His fantasy playoff schedule is super tough. He hasn't showed us any kind of time on field or usage or anything to be excited about. Rashid Rice and McCole Hardman look to be the wide receiver 1 and 2 in this offense, and if you're going to be the wide receiver 3 with Travis Kelce also commanding a target share, there just isn't enough room to be viable. Despite Patrick Mahomes being your quarterback, he has no upside. It's time to cut our ties, leave him on the waivers for good. Do not save him, do not bookmark him. But looking at another running back we should be leaving on our waiver wire this week coming out of Atlanta is Cordarrelle Patterson. And this Bijan situation has come out of nowhere and surprised a lot of people. Last week he comes out and sees 1 carry. Apparently he had some kind of headache or something coming into this game. Regardless, it's not going to be something that continues. Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier continue to see a majority of the snaps and time on field when everybody's healthy. Cordarrelle Patterson does not have a path to upside or any kind of real usage. He's a 32-year-old running back. I know Arthur Smith loves to use committees and he has been decent for this offense before, but I don't think any running back over the age of 30 has finished in the top like 25 or 30 running backs. Whatever's going on with Bijan, he's gonna be fine, and even if he's out for the entirety of the season, I don't think that Cordarrelle Patterson is gonna have enough of a role to even be rosterable behind Tyler Algier. Now obviously that's not actually gonna happen to Bijan. He's gonna be healthy. Cordarrelle Patterson saw a season high with 10 carries. It's not anything usual we can expect. If you want a Bijan handcuff, you're gonna want Tyler Algier. Leave Cordarrelle Patterson on the waivers. Don't pick him up. I don't care if Bijan is questionable. But that is going to finish off this video. If you guys did enjoy, I seriously appreciate you watching all the way through, and I will see you guys in the next video coming soon.